us 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. Wives, in the same way, submit to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Imagine a pastor. So imagine I have a pulpit up here, not a music stand. I've got a pulpit up here, and for this sermon, I have it armored. I have wings that come out on either side, and I speak through something like a gun turret. And I begin with the words, my text today is 1 Peter 3:1, wives, submit to your husbands. That's how lots of pastors feel when they come to this text. This passage has caused non-Christians and even many Christians to accuse us of being misogynistic, sexist. They call us patriarchal, primitive, obsolete. And are they right? Doesn't this passage teach that women are inferior? And isn't that what Christians believe? I think fearing that that is what we believe, some people avoid this passage like the plague. Others leverage this passage to force women to do what they want. So a few years ago, Christianity Today conducted an extensive sociological study on battered women, particularly battered Christian women. And they found that 2/3 of these women believed that obedience to God required them to endure their husband's violence. 55% said that their husbands told them that the violence would end if they would only be more submissive. And 1/3 of those women believed that their husband's abuse was caused by their failure to submit. Maybe that's why the Revised Common Lectionary and the Book of Common Prayer simply skips this passage altogether. It's been used to prop up a system of oppression and bias by sinful men who have weaponized it. It provides non-Christians ammunition to disparage us and ridicule the church. So to the people who revised the lectionary, I would say, yes, there are men who exploit this teaching to justify their sins. But you're ignoring it to avoid your fears. And neither you nor they are taking seriously this word of Christ's apostle. To take this passage seriously, we need to pay attention to 3 things. To the context in which it occurs, the context in which Peter enjoins submission. We need to pay attention to its content, what this means, and then to its contrast with husbands in verse 7. And I say contrast, and we'll read that verse a little later, but contrast may be misleading. Peter takes, as it were, side-by-side pictures of the marriage relationship because together they bring out a depth of richness that neither can produce alone. So we'll go further into that in a little bit. So we need to begin by looking at context, to which there are 2 aspects. There is social context and there's biblical context. We'll take them one at a time. Social context has to do with what the world was like when these instructions were given. How did these instructions fit into the people's lives who first received them? And then there's the biblical context. How do these instructions fit into the purpose of this letter? Are there similar statements made in other parts of this letter? How does this all work with the rest of the Bible? So let's begin with social context. When this letter was written, societies were considerably different than they are now. In Peter's day, the situation could even differ from region to region. So, for example, in Israel, women had very few rights. Under normal circumstances, they could not inherit property. They were not permitted an education. They had little choice in the matter of who they would marry, and no veto power if the decision displeased them. They could not initiate a divorce except in very, very limited circumstances. The law considered them essentially to be the property of their father or of their husband. In the Roman world to which this letter was written, that was Israel, and the Roman world to which this letter was written, especially in this area of Asia to which it was sent, things were a little different. Women could own businesses and property, for example. They did have more say in their marriages. In some regions, they could even vote and hold public office. In that sense, they're more like Western women today. They enjoy greater freedom. But freedom, when love is absent, leads to conflict. And religion can just be another battle site. Unlike most of the ancient world, many women in Asia Minor were able to choose their religion and not just adopt the religion of their husband or of their dad. So the women who read this letter had made a choice. They had chosen to abandon their husband's faith and come over to Israel's God and his Messiah. Many husbands could care less what God their wives worshiped, as long as it didn't complicate their lives. But if religion was a threat to their guild membership, in some cases that was so for Christians, or if it damaged his social standing, that was an entirely different matter. That's the social context. Now the biblical context. Look at that first verse. Wives, in the same way, submit to your own husbands. The words "in the same way" put us on notice that we must take the context into account. In the same way as what? The same way as whom? In the immediate context, in the same way clearly means in the same way that Jesus submitted, as described by Peter in the previous paragraph. Jesus submitted for a greater purpose. These wives should do the same. Jesus submitted silently without complaining or condemning, so should wives. Jesus was able to submit because he entrusted himself to God, knowing that God would right all the wrongs. That's how a wife will be able to submit. Now, let's span out a little bit from the original immediate context. If we look at the letter as a whole, will we find that submission isn't required of anyone else besides wives? We will. So in chapter 2, verse 13, Peter tells both men and women to submit to every human authority. He's talking about leaders, particularly government leaders, and to do it for the Lord's sake. And just to be clear, it is impossible to submit to anyone for the Lord's sake if submitting to them means being disobedient to the Lord himself. It's not just submission to those in authority in government. In verse 18, slaves, remember, slaves comprised the greatest part of the empire's workforce. Slaves are instructed to submit to their masters. And then further, if you go the other direction, in chapter 5, younger men in the church are required to submit to the church's elders. So the biblical context here makes it clear that wives are not the only ones instructed to submit. This submission can't be about male superiority because 3 of the 4 times it's enjoined, men are the ones doing the submitting. But if submission is not about male superiority, and it's not, what is it about? Peter makes that easy for us because each time he directs people to submit, he gives us a reason for it. So in chapter 2, verse 13, when he's talking about submitting to the government, to those in authority, it's for the Lord's sake. It's because of the mission you're on. In chapter 2, verse 19, it's because one is conscious of God. It's to win unbelievers over to God's side in chapter 3, verse 1. See, submission is part of a larger strategy to fulfill the mission that we read about in chapter 2, verses 9 through 12, to declare God's praises and bring the unpersuaded over to his side. Christians are to live such good lives that non-Christians see and end up glorifying God. They lead beautiful, exceptional lives that are obviously different from other people's. Submission is a primary. It's not the solitary, but it is a primary way that Christians are different from the people around them. The purposes behind submission, the purpose, I should say, is most clearly stated here in the case of wives. So look at verse 1 again. Notice the purpose statement. So that, here it is, if any of them do not believe, I think a better translation of that word would be are unpersuaded. If any of them are unpersuaded, they may be won over. Won over to what? To being better husbands? Nicer people? That would be a really good thing, but that's not what Peter has in mind. He's talking about winning them over to Christ. See, he is still working here from chapter 2, verse 9, all the way through chapter 3, verse 7. Everything flows out of the mission as it's declared in verses 9 and 10. That mission, Peter outlined, is this: declare God's praises while living lives that persuade the unpersuaded to come over to God's side before the day he visits us. Submission, in other words, is for the mission. Submission is for the mission. Now, that's the context, social and biblical. What's the content? What does submission entail? How are we supposed to do it? First, we submit without being preachy. I doubt preachiness has ever won anyone over to God's side. Preaching, yes. Preachiness, no. St. Peter says that they may be won over without words. How can you win someone without words? You do it by the way you live, or as the NIV has it, by the behavior of their wives. The word translated behavior is a favorite of Peter's. It occurs 13 times in the New Testament, 8 of those times in Peter's short letters. He was a believer that changed lives are powerful. Your claims can be debated. Your example cannot. Peter doesn't want wives talking their husbands to death. He wants them leading them to life by their example. CNN had a story some years ago on a couple from Berlin. Whenever this couple disagreed, which happened quite frequently, the wife would just get angrier and angrier, louder and louder, and go on longer and longer. And then at some point, the man would get up, go upstairs, turn on the old World War II air raid siren, and stun his wife into submission. When the police came, the guy said, "My wife never lets me get a word in edgewise. So I crank up the siren and let it rip for a few minutes, and it works every time. Afterwards, it's real quiet. The police confiscated the siren. The wife, they'd been married 32 years, said, "My husband's a stubborn mule, so I have to get loud." How much better if they would have just followed Peter's instructions? The word translated behavior here was the same word translated as way of life back in chapter 1. There, Peter was speaking of the aimless way of life that characterizes many non-Christians. But Christians' life shouldn't be aimless. Christians have a purpose, they have a mission. And because of it, they do things that other people don't do or can't do. What was it about a wife's example? Or for that matter, since submission is enjoined more broadly on Christians, what is it about any Christian that will win people over? It is, this is verse 2, their purity and reverence. Another way of translating that phrase is by the reverence-inspired holiness of your life. In other words, a Christian wife lives in a way that makes her belief in God obvious. She organizes her life around God. Her husband realizes his wife submits to him because she's submissive to Jesus. He knows that she's more concerned about what Jesus thinks of her than what he thinks of her. The life she leads is just inexplicable apart from God. Now, it's not that she tells him all of this. She doesn't say to him, "The only reason I submit to you is because I'm submitting to Jesus." She lives it, and he sees it. The Greek of verse 2, which the NIV translates, "when they see the purity and reverence of your lives," is really when they oversee. See, the wife isn't putting on a show. She's been overseen, arranging her life around God. That's not something the average non-Christian spouse gets to see, but they should. There's something else the spouse oversees. His wife puts more time into inward beauty than outward appearance. That's verse 3. That is not normal in any society, but it is normal in the Christian life. Peter says her beauty, this is verse 4, comes from the inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Once when I preached on this passage, a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "Look, I don't have a gentle and quiet spirit. It's just not my personality." And frankly, she didn't want that spirit because she was afraid of being pushed around. But she was mistaken in at least 4 ways. First, she was letting her fears veto God's word. She'll never see that God can be trusted until she's willing to obey him. And obedience often feels risky. If you haven't learned that yet, you will. Second, she had completely forgotten the mission, and she was acting like it was all about her. Submission is for the mission. Third, she assumed that the gentle and quiet spirit is a personality type. Any personality type can display a gentle and quiet spirit when it's being shaped by confidence in God. Fourth, she thought that a gentle, quiet spirit makes a person a pushover. She didn't realize that it was Jesus' gentle and quiet spirit that Peter wanted her to emulate. And the Lion of Judah is no pushover. In their relationship to their husbands, and a wife's relationship to her husband, as in our relationship to bosses, government officials, and fellow church members, Christians are to be a picture of Jesus. Now, we've seen how submission is one element in a larger strategy to fulfill the mission of chapter 2, verses 9 through 12, to win people over to God's side. But that picture, if we're just looking at the wife, is incomplete. It lacks depth. So Peter gives us a second picture of Christian marriage, this time angled a little differently, bringing the Christian husband into focus. Without this contrast, the picture of the wife will look flat. Her submission will not be appealing. This is verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner. By the way, did you notice in the same way again? This is still harking back to the example of Jesus, back all the way to chapter 2, verse 9, where we declare the praises of God while living beautiful lives that are different from everyone else's. Husbands, in the same way, live together according to knowledge. The Christian husband, that's a literal translation of that first part. So the NIV says, be considerate as you live with your wives, treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heir with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Literal translation of the first part of that verse, husbands, live with your wives according to knowledge. The Christian husband is to know his wife, what she likes and dislikes, what she wants out of life and what she fears, her strengths, which he celebrates, her weaknesses, of which he's considerate. There are many husbands who know more about the NFL than they know about their wives. They know who's likely to go first in the draft, and second and third and fourth and fifth. They know the average number of interceptions their quarterback threw per game last year. They know that the defensive line coach is looking at becoming defensive coordinator for another team, and they can talk on and on about how that's going to affect next season. But they don't know what their wife's favorite color is. They don't know what they do that irritates her. They don't live together according to knowledge. In a Christian marriage, a husband knows his wife. His knowledge of her is not neutral and objective, not a scientist's, but it's passionate and personal. It's a husband's. He treats her with respect, Peter says. So here's something that we can read right over and completely miss. Ancient moralists routinely, over and over again, told wives to respect their husbands. But the Christian insistence that a husband respect his wife was wildly countercultural. It stood out. God wants his people to stand out. Not because they're mean or because they're loud, but because they're like Jesus. Husbands are to relate to their wives as fellow heirs of the gift of life. I mentioned earlier that in the ancient world, most women did not inherit property. But among Christians, women were respected. They were co-heirs with their husbands. Think of how a Christian marriage would have stood out in that society. Husbands who loved and respected their wives. Wives who submitted to their husbands without talking behind their backs or complaining or nagging. Their marriages were the envy of the people around them. We need both aspects of this picture. We need a husband who knows, loves, and respects his wife, and a wife who is for her husband and chooses to submit to him. They may disagree, as two people will, but they will not stop honoring one another. And the other great passage on submission in marriage, Ephesians 5, which was read for us earlier, we have the same kind of thing. First of all, it begins with mutual submission in the body of Christ. just as Peter does, begin with submission in other relationships and then work to the marriage relationship. We have a picture of a wife who submits to her husband out of reverence for Christ. It's because of the mission. And then we have a picture of a husband who, like Christ, loves his wife and sacrifices himself for her. Do you know why the apostles always give us two pictures of marriage? One that focuses on the woman and the other on the man? I think what they're doing is giving us a stereoscopic image of marriage in the Christian life. Do you know how stereoscopic pictures work? How they differ from a regular picture? A stereoscopic picture combines two images of the same thing. In this case, it would be Christian marriage, taken at slightly different angles in order to reveal depth. In other words, they're 3D pictures. Separate the image and each one looks flat. Put them together and they jump off the page. If we separate the image of the husband and wife in a Christian marriage, what remains are duties and rules to follow and a life that looks flat and undesirable. But when we put them together, as the biblical writers do, we have this vibrant, attention-grabbing 3D image. And here's the amazing thing. When you look at the image, this is what God intends. The Christian wife and husband in a marriage of love. What you see in the picture is Christ, which is why Paul, in that long passage about Christian marriage, suddenly and unexpectedly says, but I'm talking about Christ. Christ submitting, Christ honoring, Christ loving. See, we thought that marriage was all about making people happy, but it's more than that. It's about making Christ known. When Christian people marry, their marriages get caught up into the mission. But don't think this kind of marriage is for sissies.